to our third and final part, pardon me, of our optimization webcast series. The first two sections, which I hope you enjoyed, were looking mostly at Evolver, our optimization engine, looking at deterministic optimization, creating a model, producing the best decision for you, whether there are constraints or not, and so forth. And we looked at different types of optimization in our past two webcasts. Today, we are going to extend that idea into the next, if you like, logical notion, which is optimizing deterministic spreadsheets is one thing, and obviously has a lot of value and certainly works rapidly and so on. However, there are obviously occasions, most occasions indeed, where your spreadsheet will necessarily include uncertainty. And so what we need to be able to do is to pardon me, optimize a model even though we don't know exactly what the various inputs or parameters into the problem will be. This decision-making under uncertainty, or DMUU, which is the difficult to pronounce acronym that sometimes gets utilized, is quite a nuanced topic and subject, which has the probabilistic extension to regular optimization that can sometimes take a little bit of getting your head around. So we'll spend a little while today looking at that, as well as going through some examples. Once you've got that idea, however, about how stochastic or probabilistic optimization differs from regular optimization, the actual use of RISKOptimizer is actually quite a straightforward thing. So I'll start quickly by revisiting optimization itself, and I'll do so using Evolver. But what I will do, for starters, is actually use one of the RISKOptimizer examples. Another quick note for you is that RISKOptimizer is available in at-risk industrial, which means you either need at-risk industrial or Decision Tool Suite industrial to be able to utilize RISKOptimizer. You'll know that you do have it because the button is available on the toolbar. If you don't have the RISKOptimizer button, then you don't have at-risk industrial. You'll also note that you won't have a time series button either. Now, I've opened an example here, and I'll change my settings to make it a bit easier to read. This is an example of a portfolio management problem where we would want to know what is the optimal portfolio of decision variables, sorry, of projects as measured by these or noted by these decision variables that I've highlighted here that will maximize our MPV but not exceed our available resources. If we were to utilize Evolver for this problem, we would simply be looking at trying to create the or select the portfolio of ones in these cells that are then utilized in some product functions to maximize our MPV, our expected MPV here, without violating the constraints we have for manpower and capital. So if I just make these numbers a little bit bigger to give us a bit richer picture, if I, pardon me, were to use Evolver on this model, there's a quick refresher of optimization at its basic level. These are returns, so I want to maximize them. I will maximize my MPV, and I will do so by changing these 10 cells. They all need to be zeros or ones, and there are a few ways of doing that. One simple method is to say they need to be something between 0 and 1 that is an integer. So that's a simple way of saying they've all got to be noughts or ones. There are other approaches to this problem, but we could, pardon me, utilize grouping method as well. But I'll just stick to a simple recipe. And then we have some constraints, which is that the manpower and capital as calculated cannot exceed our available resources. So relatively straightforward problem. I have my constraints, I have my constrained decision cells. And if I'll just stick with the automatic settings in Evolver and click Run, Evolver will utilize probably the OptQuest engine in this case, but either the OptQuest engine or the genetic algorithm to find a better solution and then go to a better solution until we end up with the optimal solution. You can see different values being tested on screen, and it's now chosen projects 1, 4, 5, 7, 8 and 9 for our portfolio. We can see that neither constraint is violated. We actually have some extra manpower up our sleeves, but we have maximized our MPV. Great. That is, if you like, the basics of optimization. We have a decision, we have constraints potentially, and we want to find the best solution. But there's something missing that actually has been built into this model but wasn't part of the analysis that I just ran. And that problem is that the actual amount of manpower required, capital expended, our actual CapEx, and also what the MPV will be, these are actually uncertain. Pardon me. So for different possible values of the manpower required, capital required, and MPV generated, sometimes my MPV is very good, but also potentially my constraints will be violated. But for the same decision, sometimes only one constraint will be violated. See if I can get one where neither are violated. It's okay. Eventually there'll be one, but I keep clicking and I'm not getting to it. So essentially what we have is a situation where the optimal decision without uncertainty actually violates our constraints sometimes when you include the uncertainty that we know. As you can see, sometimes I've gone through all those options recently. Sometimes there's one constraint that's been violated, sometimes both, and sometimes none. So the question remains, how do we then cope with this uncertainty, especially when our variables potentially have a lot of skewing, or there are risks such as a risk register type risk event, which is sometimes catastrophic and so on. How do we actually determine the optimal decision with all of this uncertainty in the model? A quick example would be that based on simple averages or estimates, it would be mathematically incorrect or suboptimal to purchase insurance, or indeed most mitigation strategies. But it's not because of averages that we purchase those, it's to protect ourselves against tail events. So as soon as we include the notion of uncertainty, we see that the way we would make a decision would potentially be different. Now, if there isn't much uncertainty or it's relatively symmetric, then Evolver will solve problems perfectly acceptably. Likewise, if we actually do have a linear problem, which by construction won't have uncertainty in it, then we would certainly need to use Evolver to solve that. However, for regular types of optimizations, we may decide that our Evolver decision, especially as I'm looking at my results here and just how often I'm actually going over budget on one of my two aspects, how often those bad outcomes occur, we'd say that this deterministically found solution is definitely suboptimal. So we need to look at more details at actually what is or isn't optimal about this. Now the first aspect that's obvious in our model here is that sometimes our constraints are violated and sometimes they're not. So in the back of our minds we need to keep an idea there that there will be some potentially acceptable or unacceptable level of violation of that constraint. And when we look at constraints again, we'll look at that in more detail. But before even looking at the constraints, and of course not all optimizations are constrained, we need to think about what our objective actually is. When we have a deterministic model and we utilize Evolver to optimize it, the output cell is a calculation. It's just a value where all of the numbers that are on the screen equal that amount, and that's it. So we adjust our decision values to make our optimized cell, our objective, either as big or as small as we want it. Or the third option, of course, which is to have it equal a target value. But in an uncertain model, which will realistically be almost all of the models that you're looking at, our output is not a value, it's actually a distribution. It looks like this. Obviously, that's a very quick simulation, but it is a range of possible values. It has an expected value, but it also has a standard deviation. It has various percentiles, and has a shape, potentially defined by its skewness and or kurtosis. So these, the output cell itself is definitely no longer a value, so it makes no sense to talk about minimizing or maximizing that value. It's instead a shape. So we need to decide what is the optimal shape that we would like to have. Now that question is very difficult to answer because it's difficult to discuss things in terms of shape. And that's not a matter of using the notion of a shape parameter that distributions have either. We just have a general idea that this particular distribution either is or is not appealing to us compared to another shape, which might have some sections of it being good and some sections being bad. There's never generally and absolutely always the best solution. Under certain circumstances, a different decision would be optimal, and then we would get a nicer distribution from that. That type of discussion, however, presumes we know what's going to happen, and that defeats the whole notion of having an uncertain model in the first place. So we have uncertainty. We need to make a decision that either never violates our constraints or violates them in, with an acceptable probability, as in an acceptably low probability. Then we also need to have a decision that looks optimal to us in terms of what it does to the output distribution. Now, as I mentioned, we don't, when we have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of different possible decisions, we are not going to produce a distribution graph for all of those and compare them. If we only have a few decisions, then it would be reasonable to utilize the risk table function, and then we can, in quite a big level of detail, compare the distribution profiles or risk profiles or output distributions, whichever way you'd like to say it, exposure charts, of our output under different circumstances and decide which one is optimal. That would be very specifically comparing the exact shapes and everything about those shapes to decide which option we will choose. But an optimization problem, as I mentioned, we might have millions of different possible combinations of decisions. Each of those may or may not violate various constraints. It's all very complicated and certainly beyond the scope of utilizing a simple risk table type comparison. So we need to make a simplification. We need to pare back our optimization idea to look at a few specific aspects or characteristics or in particular statistics of our output function and optimize those. As always, we can only optimize one thing at a time. That thing could potentially be made up of multiple statistics. If you were to divide your expected value by your standard deviation, say, then if the expected value goes up or the standard deviation goes down, then generally that quotient will increase. Although, of course, if both of those things change simultaneously, you might find the value going up or down despite it not being in a good way, so that the expected value could drop considerably. But if the standard deviation drops by even more than the number itself, that coefficient of variance is even higher and so on. But generally we will optimize a single statistic, the most common approach being to optimize the expected value of an output cell, either make it bigger or smaller. Then if we have any concerns about other characteristics of the distribution, we can include those in, we can include those in the constraint set. So let's take a little bit of a look at the nuts and bolts of this problem. If I go to RISKOptimizer and my model definition, I see that it's already been built for me, which is nice. I am maximizing the expected value of the output cell. And here we see the first difference between RISKOptimizer and Evolver. We're not optimizing a cell, we're optimizing a statistic of that cell. We, of course, have a choice of statistics. We could optimize the mean, optimize the volatility, optimize the skewness. That's pretty obscure, but we can do it. Optimize the kurtosis. That's not, I won't say it's popular, but it is something that it is sometimes used, as kurtosis can be thought of as a measure of tail weight. So if we reduce our kurtosis, then we are reducing the weight in our tails, which is potentially reducing the risk. Or alternatively, we might want to increase our kurtosis to maximize our potential for big returns, that type of thing. Also minimizing or maximizing the actual minimum or maximum values that our output distribution shows. Working on the range, so again another issue around volatility. Or, and this is more likely to appeal to people in a risk analysis environment, optimizing a percentile or a particular target value. So for example, you might ask what portfolio of projects or investments minimizes the probability of a loss or maximizes the probability of us making more than $10 million and so forth. Alternatively, and more generally, we might try to, say, maximize a low percentile of our returns, whether it be for a single investment or multiple investments, knowing that if I have increased my P5 as much as it can be, then I have, by construction, eliminated a lot of my exposure. It may be that eliminating exposure also reduces my potential for upside, but that's a decision that I make based on, as always, the risk appetite of our organization. For this example, I will just stick with maximizing the mean. So I'm going to maximize the expected value of our portfolio of projects by, as we saw before, changing these values here from zeros to ones as integers. Now, in the constraints section, I've got a very interesting concept. We noted that for the optimal portfolio that was generated by Evolver, sometimes my constraints were violated, sometimes they were not. There are a couple of different ways of dealing with this notion that constraints sometimes can be violated. If this were a physical impossibility to get more capital or more people, then it can't be violated. It's just a physical thing. It's illogical that we could ever go over that, such as the capacity in a plant or hours in a day, that type of thing. There are some physical issues. However, if I had a fantastic solution that sometimes required me to find one extra person, I would go and hire that person. If there was a great portfolio of projects that required $1,000 more or $1 more, I would find that dollar. I would find those $1,000. I might even find $10,000. I can get credit. I can do something. So the reality is that although these levels are what we would prefer to not exceed, it will be okay to exceed them sometimes. Two ways of approaching that. One we've discussed previously in the optimization webcast, and that is to use a soft constraint. Whenever you think you need to use a soft constraint, do so. They're an excellent tool whereby they penalize solutions that exceed constraints but do not automatically reject them. Having a constraint as hard does automatically reject any solution that violates the constraint. So we could use a soft constraint in this case and say that for every person over 800 or for every dollar over 100,000, there will be some amount of penalty taken off the calculated MPV. that does require us to have some understanding of what the penalty function will look like, and whether we have increasing levels of penalty as the penalty gets worse, whether we want it linear, whether there's an initial hit, but then the difference between asking for $50,000 and $60,000 is so minimal, it's not actually 20% worse. So we might want a decreasing function, something that's a bit more of a square root type function rather than being exponential or logarithmic function. But again, there's a body of knowledge in that. We're going to take a fairly simple but a quite elegant approach in this particular example, which is, and it's also an approach that would suit management in terms of understanding what's going on. I can simply say, with what probability would we like to have these constraints met? In this example, it's 95%. So what we are saying, in other words, is that as long as this constraint has a less than 5% chance of, at the end of the day, getting violated, that's acceptable. So I can put a value on, if you like, the level of risk that I'm willing to take. We would be unhappy if it were more than 5% likely that we'd need to get more cash. But if it's only a 5% chance or less, totally acceptable. And the same for manpower. The way this will be done is by running a simulation and finding out what proportion of the simulation itself violated this constraint. That proportion would be determined by calculating the mean of the cells G14 and G15. Let's just see what that means. Let's cancel back to here. These cells are a simple if statement. If that is less than that, it's okay. If it violates it, then it's a 0. Therefore, after a simulation, the expected value of this cell equals the proportion of 1s in the simulation, which in turn equals the probability of this cell being a 1, which we know to interpret as the likelihood that the constraint will be met. Easy. So it takes a few sentences to explain, but as you can see, it's actually quite simple, but elegant in that it allows us to put a particular risk level onto this condition. So I will accept any portfolio where there is no more than a 5% chance that these constraints will be violated. That means that my optimal decision, if I then proceed with that choice, after all of these projects are finished, I may have found that I bust through my CapEx constraint or I bust through my manpower constraint, but these things had less than a 5% chance of occurring. And this analysis confirms that for me. So what I will do is go back to my original or starting portfolio, which was the first 3 projects, quite conservative. There would still be some chance that they could exceed maybe the capital constraint, possibly not the manpower constraint, but the NPV itself is quite low. So is there a better combination that will maximize the expected value of my NPV, but not have more than a 5% chance of the violation here? All right. So if I go into RISKOptimizer, I have my model defined. I'll quickly check my settings. It's set to run 1,000 trials, so we'll stop it long before that. That's okay. I will go back to that quickly. Just to note, the same notions for an evolver optimization are used for the runtime in RISKOptimizer. A fixed number of trials, a fixed amount of time. Neither of those are necessarily great options. Logically, the better option would be a progress one, whereby we would accept if there had been no change whatsoever for a while. Let's just say that the software has reached a global optimal solution, or if our optimal solution isn't necessarily going to be the absolute best, it will be the least acceptable, we might use a formula is true option. So as soon as we've got it such that a particular condition is met, we're happy with that. We're happy with any solution that can actually meet that condition. That would be an example of a formula is true usage. So now I go to start my optimization. You can see our screen flicking around a little bit. My apologies for that. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the medium that we're looking at here, the optimization is running very slow. For anyone who has seen RISKOptimizer run in real life, you'll know that it's nowhere near as slow as this. But I may, just to give us a solution in half the time, reduce the number of iterations down to something tiny like 50. The point is to simply get the software running. We're not actually strictly interested in generating a fantastic solution right now. Just checking that we can get something better than what we have. So it's not running quickly, but it's getting through its decisions far more rapidly. So 4 trials used so far. 6 trials run and so on. So generally we would already have run, well, I'd probably say hundreds of trials so far, depending on the size of your simulation. 7 trials. So we're going to see where it's tracking here. Note that it's only found one valid solution out of a few that it's picked there. Because obviously it decided that the initial solution violated the constraint, and so it hunted around to find a solution. Now that we've started, we're on our way. As always, I can see my results as they come in. It can be quite interesting to view the progress steps to see how long it takes to think to find a new solution. So after the first 9 trials, where it was looking at putting no projects into the simulation, certainly not violating the constraints in any way. However, once it found the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th solutions, we saw big increases in the result, as we can see there. And this is, as we saw with Evolver, the type of solution we would expect a rapid improvement, and then this will eventually taper off. So I'll stop that model there and look at the portfolio that we are left with. Projects 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7. Now let's just confirm exactly what it is that we've done and why this is different to just using Evolver. We have probability distributions in our model where the capital and manpower can vary, but so too can the NPV. We decided that there was an acceptable level of violation of these constraints of only 5%. So we need to keep adding different projects to our portfolio, maybe swapping some out, including some extras in, to try and maximize the mean of our MPV. And at each stage we did maximize or increase the mean of our MPV. And as it turns out, we've done so with our, pardon me, at that point we've done so with the expected value of our, or the likelihood of our manpower and capital constraints being violated being no less than 5%. Now, because I had to cheat the system because it was running a little bit slowly and only ran 50 iterations, which of course is way too small, I just ran another 50 with my currently optimal solution and found that there was actually an 8% chance of violating that mean capital constraint. If I run it again, run the simulation again, we'll see what it believes the failure rate is. So it was 92, now it's 94. Clearly we need to run more than 50 iterations to check this solution, but obviously when we run a risk optimizer model for real, we don't do such a small number of iterations. That's why the solution is jumping around a lot as to whether or not the probability of violation was too great. But what we have done, and if you like, this is the important part, is that we have optimized some aspect of our output distribution. This is conceptually different to another type of any other type of optimization. Optimization uncertainty requires us to perform such a feat, to say this is the task that we need to achieve. We aren't simply going to make our MPV better. We need to be specific and say what aspect of our MPV needs to be improved, in this case the expected value. If I put this one away and get a different example, go back to my example spreadsheets. Again, just a reminder that the things that we're looking at here are all found in the example spreadsheets. There's a risk optimizer section of at risk, where risk optimizer has, of course, recipe, budget, order, scheduling problems, and there's also in our XDK examples of utilizing or controlling risk optimizer using VBA for Excel code as well. So there are more risk optimizer examples here, noting that risk optimizer, just like any other feature of at risk, can be completely or have parts of it automated using VBA for Excel coding. So just to mention that one there. So if I look at another problem, news vendor hotel booking, let's say ordering style goods. I like the fact that it had the word style in the title. Now, in our explanation here, we are trying to, pardon me, we have a forecast for the demand for the goods that we're selling. However, of course, there will be uncertainty in any such model. Okay, so we have uncertainty around the actual demand. We've got early season and late season demand. So what should be our optimal ordering decisions? So not everyone's working in project portfolio management. Here, I'm trying to maximize, again, the expected value of my profit, but that will involve me making decisions about how many goods to order, what we will consider to be our decision variable for ordering later, and also just another factor here, which is the multiple for that. Okay, so any values within that region. There are no other constraints, but clearly for any particular decision, my profit itself could vary considerably. I saw a value there around the 2,000 mark. Sometimes it's up closer to 10,000, over 11 there. So there is a lot of uncertainty in the model itself. Potentially, if I ran a bigger simulation, there would be maybe even some losses, but there could be a scope for improving the expected value considerably. So if I go to RISKOptimizer and start my simulation, or sorry, my optimization, as we know, it will simulate and utilize the Evolver engine to improve the expected value of my output, and we're tracking the expected value of the profit here. Pardon me. So here we have the classic, if you like, compromise, where if we order heaps of stuff and demand happens to be high, great. If it's low, we're at a risk of losing money. If we don't order enough to meet demand, then that's great. We make our money off what we ordered, but then there's all this foregone or an opportunity lost, if you like, on the profit that we could have made if we'd ordered enough. So I've seen some gains there. I'll stop my run there. And so I now have a distribution of my profit looking like this. So you can see the expected value has shifted considerably, and the shape itself is quite different. I'm now far more likely to be getting large profits, and then there are some unfortunate examples where profits are low, or I could even lose money. Now, once again, I've only considered a single aspect of my output when it comes to producing my optimization. What is the best expected value? Now, we looked at including riskiness in our constraints previously with that elegant little solution for what's the probability of violating a constraint. But that's a constraint, that's a separate thing, or separate aspect of the model. What about another aspect of the profit itself that I would be interested in? For example, when I look at my output distribution, I see that there is quite a big spread of potential outcomes. Although the expected value is now good, have I actually made a shape that I like compared to what I saw previously? Perhaps the standard deviation is too high. Or perhaps the P5 or some other low percentile is too low. Well, I can include ideas like that or ways of thinking about my model like that in my constraint section. So I can actually constrain aspects of the distribution of my output. So get better decisions, run the simulation, check the goal of my optimization, but also make sure that I'm not violating other ideas that I have about my profit distribution or whatever the output may be. So if I go into my model definition, there are no constraints there currently, but I can add specific constraints about my output cell. Previously, there was no constraint on the output cell. It didn't make sense because the output cell would just want to make as big or as small as possible. But now the output cell is a distribution, so aspects of it we might like to constrain. An example might be that the standard deviation of our output, we want it to be less than 1,500. I note that it was around 2,000 previously. So is there a solution that has a standard deviation less than 1,500 to begin with? That's the first thing. Actually, I'll make it 2,000 so it's a little bit easier to hit. So in this case, the simulation will be run. The expected value of the profit will be checked. Is it good? Yes. Then RISKOptimizer will come to the constraints and say, but did it have an acceptably low level of volatility? And that's how the model will run this time. So if I go back to my original solution, there's my original set of values there. And I have a quick look at the result that comes out of the basic model. Oh, I don't think I checked the button. So my initial simulation had a expected value of 7,200 and a standard deviation that was 1,600. So in other words, it was acceptable in terms of the volatility, but I wondered whether I could get my mean to be higher. So I'm trying to maximize my mean, but never let the standard deviation go above 2,000. The solution I stopped at previously did have a standard deviation above 2,000. So although the expected value was good, the volatility was unacceptably high. So I now have RISKOptimizer set to consider both of those issues. So I'm asking, what is the decision that has the highest expected value but does not have a standard deviation greater than 2,000? These constraints, in particular constraints upon the output distribution like this, are a perfect way of getting pardon me, RISKO to enable you to include not necessarily arbitrary, but sort of arbitrary business ideas that the organization wants to have you take note of. I see this a lot with the portfolio management groups, stock and investment portfolio management groups, where they want to produce a particular investment option or package for a client who has specific requirements. They want a certain percentage expected return, but they want their P5 or some other statistic to not be below some unacceptable level. And as always, because we now have constraints, it is possible that RISKO, just like Evolver, could ask for or attempt a solution that then, it turns out, violates the standard deviation constraint. So roughly half, well, currently exactly half, but half of the solutions seem to violate the constraints. And so far, RISKO hasn't found one where the mean was improved, but that didn't violate the standard deviation constraint that I put on it. Let's see, let's go back to my progress steps. Let's see, I put standard deviation 1717. Now it's allowed it to go up to 1828. It's found a solution whereby the expected result was higher. So we have actually made some progress, which is nice. And again, obviously running this properly, not trying to display it over the web like this. We'd run a bigger simulation. It would also be running a lot quicker, and we would have hit these improvements a long time ago. But once it's going, of course, it's exactly the same idea as Evolver and the optimization problems that we've looked at over the last 2 weeks. The key, once again, when we're looking at decision-making under uncertainty, is to realize that any decision you make will sometimes be good and sometimes be bad. You have to decide things like how often are you willing to accept that bad outcome, such as the first example that we looked at where we had a probability of violating the various constraints. You also need to rethink your output in the same way you rethink it when you run an at-risk simulation. And that is, it's not a value. It is not a number, and we are not trying to predict a single outcome because we know that it's going to be wrong. Instead, we're going to say, in general, what would be the best solution for us? What would be the best set of decisions that we can make? Remembering that we can have various constraints on the decisions, constraints on aspects of the model, constraints indeed on the output cell itself in terms of its volatility or its kurtosis, or a high or low percentile, or its range, or its minimum return, and so on. With all of those things going on, what aspect of our output would we like to improve? Because we're making some nice healthy gains now. What aspect would we like to improve? And if the organization has within it some notion of risk aversion, we can include that. We can include that directly in our model. Let's hit a rich vein of improvement here. We can put that directly in our model by saying, do you think riskiness is volatility? If the answer is yes, then I'll put in a constraint on the volatility. Very simple to do, as you saw. It just means we have an extra 2 steps in our modeling, but we can still produce exceptionally good answers to the problems that are otherwise intractable. a lot of optimization problems are basically impossible to solve without the use of a computer, without the use of something like Evolver. And when we throw probability distributions in as well, just conceptually, they become, if such a thing is reasonable to say, even more impossible to solve. So we need to combine the notions of simulation modeling with at-risk and optimization with Evolver. Those two things that come together are basically, they're called RISKOptimizer. It did, for those aficionados of Palisade products, it used to be its own product, but it now sits inside at-risk industrial. So I'll stop my solution there. It's tapering off a little bit, but I'm sure there's more room to improve. And so if I look at my result now, I have my optimal decisions there. And I have a model whose expected value is not as high as the first one I found when I allowed my standard deviation to be completely unconstrained. But this is basically as good as it will get without letting my standard deviation go over $2,000. Okay, and we can see that amount there, 1,965, so I'm near that. There's potentially a little bit more room for improvement, but I've probably got a pretty good solution already. And note that by decreasing the standard deviation, or by constricting the standard deviation, constraining it in some way, compared to the original optimal solution that I found, I don't have as big a maximum potential, but I've lost all of my downside. In the previous example, there were definitely values below 1,000. There were also some losses. Now we're saying that with this decision set, these values for all of these items, I am actually eliminating my downside risk. I'd be certainly happier to invest in this than the first one, but that's the type of information we'd like to provide our decision makers. Now, as you saw in pardon me, the RISKOptimizer examples, all of the solving methods that we looked at over the last two webcasts with Evolver are absolutely still available to you with RISKOptimizer. If I add a new group, and I'll go in and edit that, I still choose whichever methodology that I'm looking at. So exactly the same ideas with Evolver, but I said just some extra things looking at the probabilistics of it. So what's a good approach to optimization then? Unless you definitely do not have access to Evolver, I absolutely suggest starting with that. Even if you have an at-risk model, in other words, one that has probability distributions in it, I would always suggest that you work out how to optimize that just using Evolver first. Putting in the various, say, physical constraints that you've got. Obviously, there's no output distribution, so you can't constrain that. But looking at constraints, physical constraints in the model, the constraints on your decision values and so on, and be able to produce a reasonable solution with Evolver. Then, especially if your model is quite complex and takes a long time to simulate, you could then simulate the Evolver optimal solution and see whether that outcome is reasonable or not. That could be a very good start and maybe even the end of your optimization journey. However, if you do have the time, or you are especially interested in understanding the uncertainties around your model, you can then perhaps start with that Evolver solution as a good starting point. You'll certainly have an initial feasible solution, and then think about how do I extend that. So when you Evolver the solution, pretending Evolver is a verb there, when you Evolver it, you'll get a particular result. You then simulate that result. Maybe elements of your resulting output distribution now you realize you don't like. Okay, so let's run a RISKOptimizer model, including in our constraint sets, in the model definition itself, including in your constraints those aspects of the distribution of the output that you didn't like. Potentially, such as the example we just saw, the standard deviation was too high. Broadly speaking, there was too much volatility. While I could make a lot of money, there was also the potential for losing money or getting some low returns. I didn't like that. So I can then use RISKOptimizer to further refine that result and produce something with less volatility. The lower volatility solution was still good. It wasn't low volatility and an unacceptably low expected return. The return was good, and we had eliminated a lot of our exposure. But in terms of a solving idea, we might also think that our uncertainty is the key aspect of our model that we wish to constrain. And it would be perfectly acceptable to minimize your standard deviation as a potential. Now, if you minimize your standard deviation, you probably want to avoid a portfolio of nothing. Invest in nothing, do nothing, because that standard deviation will be zero and seem to RISKOptimizer to be a wonderful solution. So you would have a minimize your standard deviation as your optimization goal, but then down in the constraints, say what is the minimum acceptable expected return, or the minimum acceptable P5 return or P25 return. Therefore, we're saying of all of the acceptable solutions, which one has the lowest standard deviation? And that might be the approach that you wish to take. But because we have the extra sophistication of uncertainty models, probabilistic models without risk, we can refine and redefine our notion about what makes a good decision or what makes the optimal decision. Pardon me. Let's try and grab, let's show you, for example, one more example model. Workforce planning. This one may take a few minutes to run, depends on how many distributions. It's got quite a long one. So once again, I'll run just a small simulation. And just as a reminder, of course, all of the pardon me, all of the example spreadsheets come with the explanation page. Some of the optimization problems can be a little bit tricky to sort of understand what's going on. So feel free to have a little look at these to see what the model's all about. They're often not straightforward cost models or cash flow models. You know, we often use optimization, of course, in logistics and problems like that, you know, workforce planning, that type of thing. Here I've got the hiring and firing of staff over the years. I've got staff shifting. How many workers do I start with? What do I get at the end? Do I meet my targets and so on? And if I look at my RISKOptimizer model, I have, in fact, as an example, 4 separate budgets that need to be met. So I have a budget issue around the number of new staff that I'm hiring up here, and this budget problem is actually a budget of 100%, similar to the Evolver example for the portfolio and what percentage of your money is going to go into each of the 8 assets. Here I have that these 3 decisions need to add up to 100%. But you can see down below that levels 1, 2, and 3, each of those separate 3 decisions as well also need to add up to 100%. So I actually have 4 different budget problems. I also have a constraint here around firing people, which is nice. It's good to know that companies will limit the amount of firing they'll do. So I'll go in and start my model, get this to run, and see if we can get some improvements in this. So as you saw, we've got going across 10 or 11 different time periods, various separate or distinct combinations of decisions that are made. So there's the initial decision. These are all related to each other. They're not related to these other decisions, but they will all have an impact on the final decisions. So if I look at my model running now, and I've managed to reduce my costs down the bottom from over 500 down to just over 100, which is a pretty nice, quick, pardon me, outcome. And again, I would anticipate there to be more progress to be made. Yep, there's some more there. I'm now below 100 from optimal solution and so on. So although I can feel there's more coming, I'll just stop that there now. And we'll use these hiring and firing levels, or hiring levels I should say, as our optimal solutions. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. I have my overall measure here of how good the solution is, and I've been able to limit those losses, or in terms of not being able to, limited my inability to meet my targets. So I'm meeting more of my targets now. Okay, and that's my output cell. If I run a simulation, there is the spread, and we saw that the expected value was down around 90, which is what we saw on our progress chart. And as I said, probably the scope for more improvement. It was only ran 50 or so trials. There is effectively an unlimited number of combinations here, so 50 is probably not enough to believe that we have found the absolute optimal solution. Okay? But again, there's a different style of model, and with the unique feature of having multiple decision sets, each of them having their own personal rules, but us wanting to solve all of these simultaneously. Okay. And this model itself, let's open the model window, had 120 inputs and 5 outputs in it. So not an incredibly large probabilistic model, but certainly bigger than the other examples that we've shown you. This one has 120 pieces of uncertainty. As always, there's no limit to how much uncertainty there can be in the model, but this was, as you saw, was able to rapidly improve the solution regardless. So I'll put that example away. And what I'll do is wrap up our 3-part optimization series there. Please do go have a look back at the other videos, webcasts that are online on our website and also on our YouTube channel. Just remember that the use of basically all of our products is to improve your decision making. That's why it's called the Decision Tools Suite. Whether you're looking at sensitivity, looking at data analysis, decision tree analysis, which is indeed another type of optimization. These 3 parts are focused on Evolver and RISKOptimizer, which is really at the top of the tree, the pinnacle of producing a better solution. We can create problems that by paper, by hand, we simply cannot solve. If you're satisfied with the solution to a deterministic model being better than what you're doing now, then you can use Evolver. Works very rapidly, produces an excellent solution, if not the global optimal solution, very quickly, with essentially no constraints on the type of problem that you're looking at itself. Pardon me. But if you then need to include uncertainty, perhaps you know that you have a lot of uncertainty, or the solution that Evolver produced for you also had some aspects to the probabilistic version of that model that you didn't quite like, then you can utilize RISKOptimizer to help refine that solution to produce a better one. Of course, you can always start with RISKOptimizer. You just have to remember that we're no longer talking about a cell to be optimized, we're talking about a distribution. And a distribution needs to be optimized in terms of one of its statistics, such as the expected value. And from that point, we might say, oh, you know what, I really would like to also have some type of control over one or more of my other aspects, such as the volatility or tail percentiles, or the probability of running at a loss, that type of thing. So I can include those aspects as constraints. Optimize something, constrain the problem Once again, just as Evolver does, we will reach a solution that we could not have found by hand, and it will be better. It will probably be the best thing that the best decision you can make with whatever information you've given to the model that you've created. Okay, so I'll leave you there with that thought, that to really be able to say you are currently doing the best thing that you can and literally optimizing the running of some part or all parts of your organization, you do need to consider optimization. That's the only way to know that you've done it. So thank you guys all for joining me over these 3 webcasts. Keep an eye out for future webcasts, especially as new versions of our software, such as the Decision Tool Suite 7, which will be out in the future. We'll be sure to have webcasts showing you what's new on that type of thing, and other topics, both webcasts by Palisade consultants like myself, and also industry experts looking at actual case studies or examples from their real-world practices. So hope to see you all again soon, and I hope you've enjoyed this sequence on optimization.